Welcome back to the Investing with IBD podcast. It's Justin Nielsen, your host, along with Arusha Paris, who joins me every week. He's a portfolio manager over at O'Neill Global Advisors. And we also have returning to the show, Simon Erickson, founder and CEO of Seven Investing. He's been on a number of times, and each time he kind of gives us a take of looking at those fundamentals, really kind of diving deep into what is making the story behind some of these stocks. So maybe the VHS behind the music type situation here. So Simon, when you're finding out all of this stuff, and let's also just remember you have an engineering background, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That's right.
So when you kind of get into the weeds, you really can get into the weeds on some of this tech stuff. But how is it that you find these names? What is it that you're doing to uncover these stories? And how much work are you putting into kind of the valuations and all of those things?
Getting into the weeds typically means people's eyes start glazing over and checking out when I get into the trenches of the podcast. But
Okay.
it's trying to, you try to find these big trends, right, Justin? What we try to do is look for the biggest opportunities, in my opinion, in the market happen because there's a long-term trend that's developing, and there's a certain subset of companies that's taking full advantage of that. And if your ears are ringing from hearing too much about NVIDIA or Tesla or all these other companies that just seem like they're in the headline all the time, it's kind of interesting to kind of peel back the onion to a second layer and say, yes, those companies are great. Yes, NVIDIA is up 190% this year. Yes, Tesla's up 119%. But perhaps there are other companies that are not so followed all the time. They don't have so many analysts following them and so many price targets that are similarly going to take advantage of kind of these cyclical trends or these long-term just disruptive trends that are out there. And I think that maybe the fun part for me of investing is to go out there and look for some of those. We chatted earlier in the program about kind of the strength of the NASDAQ, and we see some real important trends that are developing out there. Maybe let's start discussing some of those hidden gems and why actually they might be the next generation of winners here in the next couple of years for investors.
Mm-hmm. So Simon, I guess the one question is, how do you stumble onto some of these? Are you just going through the value chain, the supply chain here, and going and trying to figure out, okay, what companies are working with NVIDIA or whatever other big companies, or what new products are there, and what components are part of it?
It's kind of a three-step process, Arusha, for finding a big trend and then riding the wave or taking the elevator to the top floor or riding the S-curve, pick your analogy for it. But kind of the first one is it the right trend? We say that, but there's been a lot of times we see a lot of things that convince us, the hype cycle's job is to convince us that everything is the next big thing. It doesn't always work out that way. Right? 3D printing did not actually put a 3D printer in everyone's living room, right? Cannabis did not get all of us high all day and then all night, for every single day. Commercial drones, are still not replacing to a large scale the Amazon vans that are driving around. Now, it's not to say those trends won't eventually be very big, but it does seem like sometimes things get overblown out of proportion. But then on the other hand, there are some very important trends, certainly the internet, cloud computing, and now AI. You see the impact on the mass market. And those are the trends you want to go after. Pick the right trends first and foremost.
Just real quick, how do you know? Because again, sometimes, as you said, there's kind of that hype that happens. So I guess what elements do you have to tell you, oh, you got into something that's hyped versus, oh, you got into something that has some legs to it?
And it's crossing the chasm, right? Somewhere on the back there is The Innovator's Dilemma, like by Clay Christensen. But it kind of, shows that like there are early adopters, techies that are going to get super excited about this thing that they're playing around with as a prototype in their basement. But then to really get into the mass market, it's got to have appeal for everyone. Right? You see electric vehicles doing that right now. You see AI, and Microsoft's products doing that right now. When you get to that kind of momentum where it's got legs to it, that's where you can kind of separate out. Yes, this is kind of exciting. You talk about it at a trade show at CES versus this is something that's touching my life and everyone else's on a daily basis.
Okay. So I interrupted you. You were going to go to step number 2.
Step number 2 is do not compete against the 800-pound gorilla in the trend. If Arusha and I want to go start a business today and we say we are so excited, we are going to go compete directly against Elon Musk. Probably the worst business idea ever, right? You want to find ways to complement the largest players in the trend. It's good if you can go do something that Elon Musk cannot do. It's even better if you can do something that he really needs help doing. And so that's kind of the picks and shovels angle that we'll take here today is, don't go head to head and try to squash companies with larger resources and more employees and more dedicated R&D and things like that. Find ways to complement them and ride that same wave as they go out and they develop the market and get a lot of people excited about it.
If you can't beat them, join them, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, and the third step.
And the third one is follow the money, right? The kind of the old saying of great success comes from 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. Execution is everything. It's one thing to have a really neat idea. It's another one to capitalize on it, get a lot of funding behind you, get a lot of the right people on board, and then, kind of execute according to your long-term strategic plan. There's a lot of great ideas that don't go anywhere. And then there's a lot of great ideas that can last for decades. And so if you kind of look at the momentum that some of these early companies are building, don't just say, oh, that's kind of neat. Oh, they got a great CEO or whatever it might be. Follow the money. Are they attracting a lot of venture capital? Are they attracting a lot of individual investors, institutional investors? They're going to follow the best ideas and push them forward to be more successful.
Right. So maybe you could give us kind of a little case study and walk us through, a real life example of how you might approach this with your 3-step process.
So a great example of this one is Supermicro Computer.
Okay.
Supermicro is a moniker they prefer, and then SMCI is the ticker that's on this one. Justin, this has gone gangbusters in the last year or two.
Yeah, I'm not sure this qualifies as a hidden gem because it's like, wow, looks like some people might have discovered this one, right?
And 2 years ago, it was a hidden gem, right?
Absolutely.
When AI was just kind of becoming into the limelight and everyone was paying attention to NVIDIA and everything that Jensen Huang was saying, it seemed like the more times you said AI in your conference call, the higher your market cap went every single minute, right?
Yeah.
But and we talked about the chip makers. NVIDIA is designing the chips, AMD is designing the chips. You and I have chatted about the chip manufacturers, the Taiwan Semiconductors of the world that are actually, got the volumes and the production lines and they're producing them. But the hidden piece, the missing piece here was what Supermicro did, was actually installing them into the servers. Right. So you've got all these data centers, you've got all these cloud data centers, you've got corporate data centers. They want to use those processors, but you can't just look at a microprocessor and say, what am I going to do with this right now? It took expertise of a company like Supermicro who knew how to actually, compile those chips, organize them with other types of chips, put together the power, the cooling, get them installed in the server racks. And that's not as easy to do as it might initially sound. There's a lot of expertise that goes into that.
Yeah, but Simon, that kind of sounds boring.
And it was, for a lot of these companies, they didn't want to focus on those things. And so they turned to Charles Lang, who's done this for 30 years. And he worked directly with AMD and directly with NVIDIA. And he said, hey, I've got the relationships with the big tech companies that have got their own data centers. I've got the relationships with you, NVIDIA, who wants to get in with these guys. Let us bridge that gap and make it as easy as possible within a couple of weeks. When you release a new microprocessor that you're really excited about, let's go get into the data centers. And if you've looked at data center growth for GPUs for NVIDIA or the EPYC CPUs for AMD, shooting off the charts, just like this stock price chart has been shooting off the charts. Good reason for that. They rode the trend and they enabled it for the biggest players.
So kind of going back to your 3-step process, if you had identified the trend and who some of those big players are, this is kind of, hey, how do I complement them? How do I work with them in order to kind of produce those win-win situations, right? We're going to win because we're doing business with you, and you're going to win because we're getting your stuff out there quicker maybe than you could, letting you concentrate on your part, and we're taking over this part for you.
And the techie eyes glazing over engineering part that I'd like to show. I have 23 graphs I'd like to show now in the program, Justin. But for anyone listening, not really going to do that to you. But the thing that was interesting was that the engineers were saying, hey, too much power consumption for these GPUs, right? These are awesome. They can do AI. You can do everything you want to, but it's too much operating costs because they're using way too much power. And so Supermicro jumped right on that and they said, what if we could configure them differently? What if we get the most efficiency in terms of watts of power per trillions of operations per second that you're executing on these things in a way that gets your operating costs down and the performance that you're looking for? I mean, that alone has gotten this business a ton of revenue over the years.
Well, how much is that of that started earlier? I don't know the full story behind that, but that seemed to be when you talk about that problem, that seems to be like what was behind the blockchain problem with, hey, y- the more you're mining, I mean, it was one thing when it was a little bit easier, but as these problems get more complex, the computing power that's required, now you're leaving a footprint on the power grid.
It's incredible. You look at the percentage of the world's power that's just going to data, to computing
Yeah.
stuff in corporate data centers, and it's becoming so complex now, right? Intel did this with CPUs in the data center back in the 90s, and then all of a sudden we started introducing GPUs in the data centers in the 2010s. And now you've got like these complex configurations of NVIDIA's H100s with some other CPUs on the side that are working together to modernize your data center, or to get zero latency for the metaverse. I mean, it's almost mind blowing to keep up with it, especially with the innovation pace of this industry. Unless you've got 30 years of expertise doing this and right, like the back of your hand, how to configure these things. Interesting trend and interesting use case for Supermicro there.
So Simon, who are the competitors for a Supermicro? Are there any other kind of smaller kind of competitors like this, or just maybe some of the larger kind of names?
Globally, in terms of server infrastructure, they have about 5% market share. The
Okay.
largest
Wow.
player in this market is Dell, who only has 17% market share.
Wow. That's
And
interesting.
then Hewlett Packard Enterprise is the other large player with 15%. So very, very fragmented, Arusha. It's been a tough market to make any money in. That's kind of what the market you want to play in if you're a kind of an up and coming company that's still very small.
It's so
Right.
funny because when you were talking about what Supermicro does, it reminded me of Dell making these computers in his college dorm, and getting them out, or Hewlett and Packard, doing it in their garage, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, those were 90s concepts, and here we are, full circle, kind of doing it again, but with different components, more powerful components, and trying to solve different issues, as opposed to getting that computing power more available to people. Now it's getting that computing power cooled down and working efficiently. Kind of like what you went into this so much about electric vehicles in a past podcast. It's about getting that power, you know, to the engine, right? and
Yeah.
and it sounds like that's what we're doing here for the AI.
And there's an even another complementary trend on top of everything we just talked about, which is ESG right now. Justin, you
Mhm.
pointed out the energy efficiency. That is a really big trend that is getting a lot of investor attention right now. And if you ever listen to investor presentation from Supermicro, they're quick to point out, we think that we've saved our customers $10 billion in cost savings from using less power. But hey, also that $10 billion that they've saved, that has the amount of power that we required for all of that would have been 30 fossil fuel power plants. I mean, they know
Oh,
what they're
wow.
doing and how they're crafting the message too,
Yes.
because you're saying,
Uh-huh.
hey, less power, but that's also good for the environment. It gets a lot of ESG attention right now.
Mhm.
Are they being recognized for that? Like, do they get a high ESG rating because of this?
Absolutely. And that's becoming more and more important. We actually just chatted about kind of disclosures and climate change and kind of a lot of that for with Seven Investing here this past week. Super important right
Wow.
now.
hmm Now, Arusha, you've kind of gotten a little bit more onto the analyst side. Not just a portfolio manager, but also an analyst. How much of this digging kind of thing, how much of this process is something that you can readily do yourself? Is this something anyone can do, or is this really specialized to Simon only?
Well, I mean, it's
To
always
understand this stuff, right?
well. I mean, Simon kind of said it right there. I think for anybody, they can always go to the investor presentations and listen to the
Yeah.
conference calls, and and in many ways, that's the best source of information because you're hearing it right from the management how business is actually going. So that is definitely a good way. Now, even for us, we have a team, right, of analysts who will do digging on certain points, and they are specialized. So we've actually for Super Micro, we have been watching this for quite a while, and Romeo, our semiconductor analyst, has been talking about this really over the last 6 months, and it always kind of, I mean, it sounded interesting, but it also kind of sounded boring. But with the way how strong the stock really, this was one of the first stocks to hit new highs right at the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
Right. And it just refused to correct. And it was just always hitting new highs. And it was that bucking bronco. And so once the market pressure, the overall larger market pressure kind of released, it's not necessarily too much of a surprise that this is taken off. The problem is it's just really hard to get in and manage your risk. If you weren't really Johnny on the spot for this one right when it started going.
Now, Simon, I got another question for you, because looking at the numbers here, on the fundamental side, and a lot of times we look at that growth of the earnings and of the sales, and SMCI had that in spades. It just, I mean, quarter after quarter, triple digit earnings growth, double digit sales growth, and these were not small numbers. I mean, this was 1.6 billion, 1.8 billion, but then, do you have any idea what happened this last quarter? I mean, it certainly didn't seem to phase the stock. The stock still went up on this last earnings report, but it went from triple digit to 5% earnings growth and negative 5% on the revenue growth. Any idea of, is the party over?
The party's not over, but the biggest drinkers at the party are slowing down a little bit.
Okay.
They did have one undisclosed customer. It's either Apple or it's Meta Platforms, Facebook, that was 22% of revenue in the best, most festive part of the party that was going on, right? But these things kind of happen in batches, right? It's not just continually. You're always installing new chips. You might go out and say, okay, we're going to spend this much money this quarter on data center retrofits, or we're going to upgrade. But sometimes you see a little bit of lumpiness in a quarter to quarter, depending on the capex that your biggest customers want to spend. But then complementing that too is, I don't think that GPT is going away anytime soon. I don't think that Bard or Llama or any of these other large language models are slowing down. It actually seems the opposite. Like, corporations are finally embracing those. And if you do that, you've got to have the right processors and the right installations into your data center to keep up.
Yeah, it's funny because I was chatting with my cousin, who is a professor over at in Colorado Springs, and he's going to be doing a class a little bit on using Chat GPT for writing. And he was saying that he's not actually using the paid product right now because it's changing so fast. He doesn't want to learn it until right before he teaches the class,
That's interesting.
because there's so many new features coming in. He's like, I don't want to really waste my time too much on something that's going to be very different by the time my class starts in the fall. So, yeah, very, very, very big on a lot of changes happening. So, any final thoughts, Eric, Simon, on your process here? I was going to call you Erickson.
Well, Nielsen, I do. My final question is Neil. I mean, Justin. It's got to be. You kind of look at the OEM revenue of Supermicro. Not to get too into the weeds, but look at those big 22% kind of customers, because they're going to be the first ones that are going to embrace the latest and greatest processors that AMD puts out and that NVIDIA puts out. But then the rest of the market's going to try to keep up with them too, right? So part 3 of that 3-part process is you got the innovators, enable the innovators, and then watch the execution for the layer that's more of the mass market. I think that we're going to see a lot more of that with Supermicro, and they're going to add a lot of headcount to their organization in the next couple of years.